All right, good morning. We are in Romans 15. And when you think about the book of Romans, you might think of Romans 3, maybe Romans 5, maybe Romans 6. Romans 8 is a great chapter. You might think of Romans 9, Romans 12. There's great chapters in the book of Romans. But how about Romans 15? Romans 15 is just full of gold. I mean, this thing is loaded. And I want to just really tell you one thing about. I want to just give you one little thing in Romans 15. But there's a lot happening here. I want to just comment on that first. When we see the chapter starts, and it's kind of a carryover from what we saw in chapter 14. It's about the idea of, again, the stronger and the weaker, and how we are, as Pastor Joe talked about yesterday. How do we get along together? How are we the church together when we have these differences among us? And well, we are told here what we do. We look to the example of Jesus, who, as we also see Paul talk about in Philippians 2, the example of Jesus, who he counted others more significant than him. He didn't please himself, but he wanted to please others for their good, to build them up. And then I want to comment about this. This is important. Paul, he supports the example of Jesus with a quotation from Psalm 69. And he uses this quotation and uses it as if Jesus said it. Now, if you go back to the Psalms, who said that? Oh, David said it. But here, Paul says Jesus said it. And again, this is, I think, really key for how we think about the book of Psalms, which we are in right now. The Apostle Paul read the book of Psalms in such a way that he read verses in the Psalms and said, yep, Jesus said that. The Messiah said that. And this is an example. Now, I wrote more about this a couple weeks ago in Psalm 18. So go back online and read that, because there's all kinds of just amazing things here and how Paul is using the Old Testament. And it's pretty amazing what he says about the Old Testament in verse 4. He says, whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction. That's key. Did you know the Old Testament was written for you? It's not about you. It's not about us, but it's for us. The whole thing. Whatever was written for us, for our instruction, so that through endurance and through the encouragement of the Scriptures, the Old Testament specifically here, we can have hope. You want hope? Do you want hope? Read the Old Testament. My goodness. Can you believe he says that? All right, here's the other thing I want you to think about. This is another amazing thing. This is the main thing I want to talk about in Romans 15. It's the end of Romans 15 when Paul kind of makes a shift here, and he talks about his mission to the Gentiles. Paul was a minister to the Gentiles. And he understands his calling because of the Old Testament, because of the promise to Abraham, because of the nations who have always been in view when it comes to God's plan. He talks about here, that's what he's doing. He's taking the gospel to the Gentiles. And I love what he says in verse 20, where he says he makes it his ambition to preach Christ where he has not been named. That's the way we would say it. He wants to take the gospel of Jesus to people who have not heard the gospel of Jesus. We are talking about unreached, unengaged people groups, unengaged, unreached people groups all over this planet right now to this day who have never heard the name of Jesus. Paul says, I want to take the gospel to them, and I want us to take the gospel to them. We care about unengaged, unreached peoples. Now, here's the shift, a little change I want us to have when it comes to our thinking about taking the gospel to the nations. Okay? It's this, catch this. We, as the church in America, we do not take the gospel to the nations. We continue taking the gospel to the nations. And I say it that way because we are, right now, like us, we are the nations. if we're not thinking about this with some type of like American-centric approach, if we're thinking about this in an Acts 1:8 sort of way, if we're thinking about this in terms of Jewish Gentile mission, in terms of what Paul is doing here, he wants to take the gospel to Rome. He wants to go to Spain. He wants to take the gospel to Europe. If we think in terms of the nations in the biblical sense, we're the nations. We are a church in the middle of North America. We are the ends of the earth. And so it's a miracle that we believe the gospel. We're not taking the gospel to the nations. We are the nations. And so we continue to take the gospel to the nations. That's the way we should think about missions, I believe. We're not in the center here. We're not in the center. We're on the outer edges of this thing. We are evidence to the fact that the gospel has advanced. We believe because missions has existed. And so we want to get in on that, and we want to continue taking the gospel to the nations. That's the thing I want us to take away from Romans 15. We see what Paul is doing here. He is ambitious to continue advancing the gospel to unengaged, unreached people groups, which we once were. Everybody outside of Jerusalem at one time was, but then the gospel spread. And so what we do, we don't spread the gospel. We continue spreading the gospel. We continue taking the gospel to the nations. And that is a task, that is a calling that I want us as a church. We're a young church. We're growing. I want us to be more involved. I want us to be more on the front lines, more closer to the heart of God when it comes to this mission that Paul talks about, continuing to take the gospel to the nations. God, would you do that at Cities Church?